Magnus Thornwood, who had survived 7 Dakota winters and buried 2 oxen in the blizzard of 1873, looked directly into the eyes of the 19-year-old girl standing before the community meeting and spoke loud enough for every homesteader in the room to hear. When you fail, the children of this valley will freeze alongside you. The girl had no money. She had no family left alive. She had a 13-year-old boy she was not related to by blood, a dog so thin you could count its ribs from across the room, and a water-damaged book about Arctic exploration that her foster father had purchased from a traveling peddler for 25 cents 3 years before he died. 5 months later, Magnus Thornwood would be kneeling in his own cabin, burning his dining table for warmth. We watching the smoke from that same girl's chimney rise steady and strong into the frozen sky, the only smoke still rising in the entire valley. But on this September evening in 1880, nobody in the James River Valley believed a word she said. The summer of 1880 did not look like a place that could kill you. The grass ran flat and golden to the horizon in every direction. The sky stretched enormous and blue above 11 sod cabins scattered across the valley floor. From a distance, those cabins looked almost permanent, almost settled, like something that would last through whatever the prairie could throw at them. They would not last. Astrid Halverson knew this stretch of land better than most. Her foster father, Niels, had filed one of the first claims here in the spring of 1879. She had watched him measure the quarter section with a surveyor's chain, stamp the corner stakes into the hard Dakota earth, and say a prayer in Norwegian with his hat pressed against his chest. She had watched him cut the first courses of sod from the ground and stack them like bricks into walls 2 feet thick. She had helped him seal the gaps with mud and prairie grass. She had learned to read the weather in his silence, to understand the land through his careful movements, and she had watched them lower that same man into that same earth 14 months later, in June of 1880, when the typhoid came through the settlement and took him in 9 days. Astrid was 19 years old. She was the only adult left on the Halverson claim, but she was not alone. Torben had been 11 years old when Astrid first saw him on the steamboat heading up the Missouri River toward Dakota Territory. He was sitting in the corner of the deck with his knees pulled to his chest, and he was holding a dog. The dog was barely more than bones wrapped in fur. A border collie mix with one ear that stood straight up and one that flopped forward, giving him a permanent expression of confused attention. The boy was not much better. His clothes were too big. His eyes were too old for his face. His parents had died of cholera 3 days into the journey. The ship's captain wanted to leave the boy at the next port. The dog, he said, should be thrown overboard. Astrid was 17 years old. She had no money of her own. She had no authority to adopt anyone. But she had looked at that boy holding that dog. In her end, she had seen something she recognized. She had seen herself 8 years earlier, standing in a fishing village in northern Norway, with her parents' bodies still cold in the church. "He comes with us," she told Niels. Her foster father had looked at her for a long moment. Then he had looked at the boy. Then he had nodded once and said nothing else about it. That was how Torben Halverson became her brother. That was how a dog named Odin became part of their small family. And that was how Astrid learned, for the first time, that the people you choose can matter more than the people you are born to. Now Niels was dead, and Astrid stood on the porch of the sod cabin he had built, looking out at the land he had claimed, and she understood exactly how much trouble they were in. The claim was 160 acres. The cabin was 16 feet wide and 20 feet deep. The woodshed sat 38 feet to the west, half filled with cottonwood that Niels had cut before the sickness took him. The ox, a half-broke animal named Peter, grazed in the small pasture beyond the shed. Torben was 13 now, tall for his age but thin, quick with numbers, quiet in the way of children who had learned early that the world did not always want to hear what they had to say. Odin was 7, still thin, but healthy now. His border collie instincts made him a natural herder, and he spent his days watching over the small flock of chickens and the single milk cow that represented most of their remaining wealth. Together, the three of them had to survive the winter. Astrid did not yet know what that would require, but she was about to learn. It was late August when Torben came back from checking the rabbit snares with an expression on his face that Astrid had never seen before. "You need to come look at something," he said. They walked together to the small lake half a mile east of the cabin, Odin trotting ahead of them with his mismatched ears alert to every sound. The cattails grew thick along the bank, and in the shallows the muskrat houses rose from the water like small domed islands. Astrid had seen muskrat houses every autumn since they arrived in Dakota. They were ordinary things, 18 inches above the waterline, maybe 20, rounded structures of mud and cattail stems where the animals would shelter through the winter. These were not ordinary. These muskrat houses stood nearly 3 feet tall. The walls were so thick that Astrid could press her entire fist against the side and feel no give at all. She walked the bank and found 4 more houses, all of them built the same way, heavy, high, fortified. She stood there for a long time staring at those houses while Torben watched her face. "What does it mean?" he asked. Astrid thought about her grandfather in Tromsø. She thought about the winters he had survived in northern Norway, where the sun disappeared for months and the cold could kill a man between his house and his barn. She thought about the way he used to watch the animals in late summer, reading their behavior the way other men read newspapers. "It means they know something we do not," she said quietly. "It means they are preparing for something bad." The geese confirmed it. Every autumn, the great flocks of Canada geese passed over the James River Valley on their way south. They usually left in mid-October, filling the sky with their calls for 3 or 4 days before the last of them disappeared over the southern horizon. This year, they left in late September, 3 weeks early. Torben counted them. He stood on the roof of the sod cabin with a notebook he had made from scrap paper and counted every flock that passed overhead. By the end of the week, the sky was empty. "They are gone," he told Astrid. "All of them." She nodded. She had been watching too. And then there was the woman. Elias Blackwell ran the only trading post within 30 miles of the settlement. He was a hard man with a harder reputation, and he extended credit to most of the families in the valley. That credit came with interest, and that interest came with conditions. And those conditions meant that Blackwell had more power over the settlers than anyone except perhaps Magnus Thornwood himself. Astrid went to the trading post in late August to purchase salt and nails. While she was there, a Lakota woman came in to trade hides and dried berries. The woman was perhaps 50 years old, with gray streaking her black hair and deep lines around her eyes. She spoke slowly, using the few English words she knew, pointing north toward the horizon. She held up 7 fingers. "7 moons," she said. "Winter. 7 moons." Blackwell laughed. "Every winter is 4 moons, maybe 5. You people always exaggerate." The woman shook her head. She held up 7 fingers again. 7 moons, much snow, much cold. 7 moons. Then she gathered her trade goods and left without another word. Blackwell was still chuckling when Astrid paid for her purchases and walked out into the August sunshine. But Astrid was not laughing. Her grandfather had taught her to listen to the people who lived on the land. He had taught her that knowledge passed down through generations was worth more than any book or any expert opinion. He had taught her that when the animals and the elders agreed on something, only a fool would ignore them. The muskrat houses, the geese, the Lakota woman. Astrid walked home in the fading light and sat at the table where Niels used to read aloud from the Kane book on winter evenings. She thought about what 7 moons of winter would mean, October through April, snow on the ground from first freeze to final thaw, and not ordinary snow. Winter, the kind of snow that filled the coulees and drifted over fences and packed against doors until no amount of shoveling could clear them. She thought about what happened when the door was buried. You could not reach your woodshed. You could not reach your neighbors. You could not reach anyone. You sat inside until the fuel ran out and the cold came in, and then you died. She was a 19-year-old girl. She was responsible for a 13-year-old boy. Nobody would dig them out if they got trapped. She thought about that for a long time. Then she opened the Kane book and began to read. Astrid was 19 years old. She had a 13-year-old boy depending on her, a dog, and a piece of land in a place where winter could kill you in 3 minutes. The muskrats were building fortresses. The geese had fled early. A Lakota elder had held up 7 fingers and warned of 7 moons of winter. If you were Astrid, What would you do? The Claim Club meeting was held on the 15th of September in Magnus Thornwood's cabin. 11 homesteaders crowded around the table and along the walls, hats in their hands, talking about winter preparations. Magnus went through the list. 5 cords of firewood minimum, 7 preferred. Rope lines to the barn and woodshed before the first storm. Banking sod against the exterior walls for insulation. Everyone nodded. They had done this before. They knew how to survive winter in Dakota Territory. Astrid waited until they had finished. Then she stood up. She was the youngest person in the room by 15 years. She was also, she understood, the person with the least right to speak. Women did not address the Claim Club. Young women certainly did not contradict men who had survived 7 Dakota winters. She spoke anyway. She told them about the muskrat houses. She told them about the geese leaving 3 weeks early. She told them about the Lakota woman holding up 7 fingers. She watched their faces while she talked. Most of them were patient. A few were not. Then she told them what she thought they needed to do differently. Not just more wood, a different way to reach the wood. She described it in pieces, the way she had worked it out over the past 3 weeks. First, a hatch cut through each cabin roof, framed in lumber, hinged with leather, sealed against wind. An exit that no amount of snow could block, because snow could only pile on top of it, and a person could push up through snow. Second, a covered wooden framework built between cabin and woodshed before the snows came. 13 frames of cottonwood posts and crossbeams, roofed with planks, creating a passage 5 feet tall and 3.5 feet wide. When the snow buried it, the wood would hold the shape and the passage would stay clear. Third, stockpile not 5 cords, not 7, but 15. She had read about something like the tunnel in the Kane book. The Inuit built connected snow houses with passages between them. Cold air settled in the low entry tunnels and could not reach the living spaces above. The snow itself became an insulating wall. She was proposing the same principle, built with wood instead of ice, constructed before the snow arrived instead of after. The room was silent when she finished. Thomas Reinhold spoke first. He was 38 years old. It precis, German-American. The man who had built the settlement's only frame house using squared timbers and a level. He was not unkind. He was simply exact. 40 feet of tunnel, Reinhold said slowly. 5 feet tall, 3.5 feet wide. That is 700 cubic feet of enclosed space to build, frame, and roof. He thought about it for a moment. A grown man with a good crew might manage that in a week. Who builds it for you? I do, Astrid said. Torben and I. Reinhold shook his head. Not meanly, simply factually. A girl cutting a quarter cord of wood a day needs 60 days to stack 15 cords. You have less than 40 days before freeze. The tunnel takes 12 days if you work without stopping. He paused. You cannot do both. The arithmetic does not allow it. I can do both, Astrid said. You cannot. Magnus Thornwood's voice cut through the room. Everyone went quiet. He had let Astrid speak. He had been patient. He was finished being patient. I buried 2 oxen in the storm of 1873, Magnus said. I have seen snow to my chest. I have never not once seen snow bury a door that a man with a shovel could not clear by morning. He looked at the room, not at Astrid. The girl reads too many books and not enough sky. He stood up straighter. We prepare as we always have. 5 cords minimum, rope to the barn, seal the windows. That is how we live through winter in Dakota Territory. Not by cutting holes in our roofs like fools. Elias Blackwell laughed from the back of the room. The girl is touched, he said. First it was the muskrats, then the Indian woman's prophecy. Now she wants us to cut holes in our roofs based on a picture book about Eskimos. He shook his head. She reads books about the Arctic and thinks she knows better than men. Father Brennan, the settlement's priest, cleared his throat. He was a thin man with kind eyes, but his voice carried the weight of religious authority. Putting faith in the behavior of rodents rather than in divine providence, he said carefully. This is not faith. This is superstition. Garrett Thornwood, Magnus's 22-year-old son, grinned at the men around him. I will bet $5 her tunnel collapses before Christmas. Who wants in? Several men laughed. A few reached for their pockets. Helga Dahl, a woman of 48 who seemed to know everything about everyone in the valley, shook her head sadly. Poor orphan children. They will not survive January. Magnus called for a decision. The claim club voted. Astrid could keep her foster father's claim, but no communal resources would support her project. No shared lumber, no shared tools, no labor. If she wanted to cut holes in her own roof, that was her business. The settlement would prepare, as it always had. Astrid walked home alone in the September dark with Torben beside her, and Odin ranging ahead of them, his nose to the ground, his mismatched ears turning toward every sound. They do not believe us, Torben said. Astrid did not answer for a long time. They walked in silence past the Reinhold cabin, past the Bernsen claim where the widow lived with her 3 small children, past the dark shapes of sod houses that would soon be tested by something none of their owners could imagine. Swatchy, they do not need to believe us, Astrid finally said. They only need to survive. She did not say what she was thinking. She did not say that she was 19 years old with no money and no family and no help, and that she had just promised to do something that a precise German carpenter had calculated to be mathematically impossible. She did not say that she was terrified. She just walked home in the dark with her brother beside her and began planning how to save them all. The next morning, Astrid woke before dawn and walked to the property line to begin measuring the distance between the cabin and the woodshed. She found a bundle waiting for her at the boundary stake, a roll of woven willow fencing, 40 feet long, the kind used for windbreaks, and a small canvas bag containing 3 pounds of iron nails. There was no note, no name. Torben came up behind her to see what she had found. Someone believed them. Someone believed them, but could not say so publicly. She thought about Thomas Reinhold watching her at the meeting, his face showing something more complex than simple dismissal. She thought about the way he had calculated the impossibility of her task with what almost seemed like regret. She would not go to thank him. She understood the arrangement. He had not helped her. He had simply discarded some old materials he no longer needed. That was the story they would both tell if anyone asked. She carried the bundle back to the cabin and began. The roof hatch came first. Astrid chose the peak of the sod roof between 2 ridge beams, where the structure was most solid and the sod lay thinnest. She marked a rectangle in chalk, 30 inches wide by 36 inches long. Then she cut. Sod comes up in bricks if you cut it correctly. Straight down with a flat spade, then pry from the side. She had watched Niels do this when they built the walls. She did it now on the roof, kneeling on the slope, working brick by brick until the hole opened beneath her. She could see down into her own cabin, the stove, the table, the cane book on the shelf where Niels used to sit and read aloud on winter evenings. She framed the opening with 4 pieces of lumber salvaged from a broken wagon bed, notching them to sit against the ridge beams, hammering them with an iron mallet. Then the door. To her 3 planks battened with cross pieces. She cut 2 strips from an old harness and nailed them on as hinges. She threaded a length of hemp rope through a hole bored in the center of the door, knotted it on top, fixed a wooden handle to the underside. From inside, she could pull the handle and the door would rise. She sealed the frame with a strip of old wool blanket and rubbed tallow into every joint. Then she climbed the ladder, pushed the door open from below, and pulled herself through onto the roof. She stood in the September air and looked at the settlement. 11 cabins, 11 woodsheds, 11 chimneys, all of them looking exactly like they always had. None of them with hatches, none of them preparing for what was coming. 2 days of work. The hatch was done. She gave herself 20 minutes to rest. And then she went to the James River for wood. Cottonwood grew thick in the river bends 4 miles east of the claim. What the river offered was free, and free was all Astrid could afford. She spent 3 days making runs with a hand-pulled sled, hauling poles 6 feet long and 4 inches across, stacking them beside the cabin until she had 26. 4 miles there, 4 miles back, twice a day when she could manage it, the sled loaded with 6 or 8 poles, the rope cutting into her shoulders on the return trip. Torben helped when he could, pulling alongside her, his thin arms straining against the weight. Odin ran ahead of them, circling back, running ahead again, as if he understood that something important was happening, but did not know exactly what. They arrived home after dark. They ate cornmeal mush. They slept without dreaming, and the next morning they did it again. On the fourth day, Astrid began splitting. Each pole became two posts. She notched the tops to accept a crossbeam. She cut the crossbeams from salvaged wagon sideboards, 3.5 feet across, rough sawn but solid enough to hold the weight of packed snow. She assembled the first frame in the yard and stood it upright to test. It held. 13 frames total. One every 3 feet from the cabin's west wall to the woodshed door. 38 feet across. She set the first frame on September 22nd. Digging the post holes was the worst part. The soil was hard clay with thin topsoil over it, and the flat spade rang against it with every blow. She drove each post 2 feet into the ground, tamped it with a river rock, braced it with a diagonal strut. Then she set the crossbeam. Then she laid planks across the crossbeams. Rough boards, wagon sideboards, anything flat to form the roof of the passage. She worked 14 hours a day. She woke before light and quit when she could no longer see. Her hands cracked at the knuckles and bled every morning until the cold air warmed them enough to move freely. By the end of the first week of frame setting, she had 6 standing. The passage ran 20 feet from the cabin wall, 18 feet more to the woodshed. Her shoulders had gone from aching to something past aching. A deep burn she no longer noticed unless she stopped moving. She did not stop moving. On the 8th day, Thomas Reinhold appeared at the edge of the property. He stood there watching Astrid set the 7th frame, his hands in his pockets, his face unreadable. He watched for a while without speaking. "How many total?" Reinhold asked finally. 13, Astrid said without stopping her work. "Done in 4 more days if the weather holds." Reinhold looked at the passage, the 6 completed frames, the rough plank roof, the open sides where snow would eventually pack and hold. He was a man who understood construction. He measured things with his eyes the way other men measured with tools. "The frames will hold under snow weight," he said slowly. "Assuming you pack the outside tight with brush before the storms come. If you leave it open on the sides, the first wind will drive drift straight through." Astrid had already thought of this. She told Reinhold about the willow fencing, how she planned to weave it into the spaces between frames, creating a wall that snow would accumulate against rather than through. Reinhold looked at her for a long moment. "Where did you read that?" "Kane," Astrid said. "The Inuit build connected snow houses. They pack the outside of the walls so the snow builds up around them, not through them. I just built the inside support in wood first." Reinhold said nothing. He studied the frames a moment longer. Then he walked away without another word. 3 days later, another bundle appeared at Astrid's property line. 50 feet of heavy rope, the kind used for hauling timber, thick enough to hold a person's weight in a blizzard. There was no note. Astrid used the willow fencing to side the tunnel frames that same afternoon. She did not go to thank Reinhold. She understood that thanks would embarrass him, would force him to acknowledge what he had done. He had not helped her. He had simply discarded some old rope he no longer needed. Old Sven Lindqvist came on the first day of October. He was 72 years old, the oldest person in the settlement, a Swede who had arrived in Dakota Territory in 1871 and watched 3 waves of settlers come and go before this current group. He walked slowly, leaning on a stick cut from ash wood, but his eyes were sharp and his mind was clear. He stood at the edge of Astrid's property and looked at the tunnel for a long time. He looked at the roof hatch. He looked at the frames standing solid in the autumn light. Then he looked at Astrid. "The rings on the muskrat houses," he said quietly. "My grandfather in Dalarna, he read them too. I had forgotten." He paused. You reminded me." He could not help with the physical labor. He was too old for that. But he had brought something else. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small leather-bound notebook, its pages yellowed with age. "My grandfather's note," he said. "The winter of 1814 in Sweden. The snow buried the church steeple that year. Only the weather vane showed above the surface." He pressed the notebook into Astrid's hands. "You should have this." Astrid took the notebook carefully. She did not know what to say. "Thank you," she finally managed. Sven shook his head. "Do not thank me. Just survive, and make them remember why the old ways matter." He walked away slowly, leaning on his stick, and Astrid stood holding the notebook and watching him go. The widow Sigrid Bernsen came that evening. She was 35 years old with 3 children. The oldest was 7, a boy named Lars. The middle child was 5, a girl named Greta. The youngest was 4, another girl named Elsa. Her husband had died the previous winter, not from cold but from a fall. He had been climbing to fix the roof and had slipped on ice and broken his neck. Sigrid had almost no resources, almost no help, almost no chance of surviving another winter alone. She stood at Astrid's door with her 3 children clustered around her skirts, looking at the tunnel frames, looking at the roof hatch, looking at this 19-year-old girl who had dared to contradict the entire settlement. "I believe you," Sigrid said simply. "I do not have the strength to build a tunnel, but can you teach me to cut a hatch?" Astrid looked at her for a moment, at her tired face, either at her thin hands, at the 3 small children who depended on her. "Yes," Astrid said, "I can teach you." She went to the Bernsen cabin the next day and showed Sigrid exactly how to cut the sod, how to frame the opening, how to build the door, how to seal the edges. Sigrid's children watched from the corner of the cabin, silent and wide-eyed. "If you are wrong," Sigrid said as they worked, "I lose a piece of my roof. If you are right, I keep my children." She did not say which outcome she expected. She just cut the hatch and sealed it carefully and thanked Astrid for coming. Astrid had a secret ally who left supplies at her property line. She had an old man who believed in the old ways. She had a widow who trusted her enough to cut a hole in her own roof. But she still needed 8 cords of firewood, 20, and she had less than 6 weeks before winter arrived. Do you think she could do it? The frames were finished on October 8th. Astrid walked the length of the passage from the cabin wall to the woodshed door. 5 feet of clearance inside, 3.5 feet wide. The plank roof did not flex under her hands. The willow sides held their shape. The entry at the cabin end had a rough wooden door, salvaged planks with leather hinges that swung inward. She stood inside the passage and thought about February. She thought about snow packing against the willow walls, pressing in, filling the gaps, turning the passage into a tunnel through solid white. She thought about walking this route in darkness while the blizzard raged above her. She thought about the families in those 11 cabins who had laughed at her and voted against her and called her touched. Then she went to the woodshed and counted what she had. 3.25 cords of split cottonwood and elm, stacked tight from floor to rafter on the north wall. She needed at least 7 or 8 cords to get through a normal winter. More if the winter went as long as the Lakota woman said. She could not cut 8 cords in 6 days. She could not. She cut 2 1/3 cords in 6 days. She worked by lantern light in the mornings and by fading daylight in the evenings. She ate once a day. She slept 5 hours. Torben worked beside her when he could, stacking the split wood, carrying it to the shed. His thin arms were stronger than they looked, and he never complained. Not even when his hands cracked and bled like hers. On the last night, Astrid sat on the woodshed floor and could not stand up for a full 3 minutes. 5 2/3 cords total. Reinhold had been right about the arithmetic. A girl and a boy could not do it all. But Astrid had one more idea that Reinhold had not accounted for. She spent October 12th and 13th gathering hay. The sloughs east of the James River held stands of coarse grass that settlers called slough hay. Wild, dry, rough as rope. During summer, it was nearly worthless as fodder and ignored as fuel. Torben had found a mention in an old Omaha newspaper, 3 months out of date when it reached the settlement. Russian Mennonite settlers to the south had been twisting slough hay into tight coils and burning them in their stoves when wood ran short. Slow burning, smoky. I stacked 300 pounds of hay coils, stacked 300 pounds of hay coils inside the cabin itself, against the east wall, where the heat from the stove would keep them dry. 5 2/3 cords of cottonwood in the woodshed. 300 pounds of hay twists inside. A tunnel to reach the wood. A hatch to reach the surface. It was not 15 chords. It was not even close to Reinhold's numbers, but it was something none of the others had. Astrid fell asleep on October 14th with the cane book open in her lap, the lantern burning down, the temperature outside dropping through the 20s toward the teens. She did not yet know exactly what was coming, but she had built everything she knew how to build, and she had done it with a boy and a dog and no help except anonymous bundles left at property lines. And now there was nothing left to do but wait. October 15th arrived with thunder. Not summer thunder, not the low rolling sound that came from far away and warned of rain. This was different, sharp, inside the clouds, the kind of sound that made animals nervous and made Odin whine and press himself against Torben's legs. The sky to the northwest had gone the color of a bruise. The air smelled like iron. And then the snow came. It came in a wall. 1 minute, Astrid could see the Thornwood cabin 200 yards northeast. The next minute, she could see nothing but white. The wind hit the west side of the cabin like a body thrown against it. The stove banked for the evening. To breathe hard as the pressure changed. The windows went white. The sound was enormous. Astrid climbed the ladder to the roof hatch, cracked it an inch, and looked out. Nothing. Just snow moving sideways with enough force to cut skin. Just white in every direction, so thick she could not see her own hand in front of her face. She let the hatch fall shut. Outside, across the settlement, 11 families would be pulling on their ropes to reach their barns, stacking wood by their stoves, sealing their windows against the driving cold. This was what they had prepared for. This was the normal storm, the kind they knew, the kind Magnus Thornwood had survived 7 times. But Astrid had seen the muskrat houses. She had seen the geese leave early. She had heard the Lakota woman's words. She sat in her cabin with Torben beside her and Odin at their feet. And she understood something the others did not yet know. This was not the storm. This was just the first one. The storm of October 15 raged for 36 hours. When it finally broke, Astrid pushed through her roof hatch into still cold air and blinked against a white world. 2 feet of snow lay flat across the valley floor. The drifts ran higher, 5 feet, 6 feet, 8 feet, against anything that broke the wind. Fences were buried to their top rails. The path between her cabin and the Thornwood place had ceased to exist. She dropped back through the hatch and walked to the passage door. Inside the tunnel, it was dark and cold and silent. The wind had not reached it. The plank roof held a ceiling of packed snow, and she could see the weight of it bowing slightly between the frames. But the cottonwood posts did not flex. She walked the full length of the passage in a crouch, her lantern casting orange light on the walls of willow and snow, and arrived at the woodshed door dry and upright. The tunnel worked. She stood in the woodshed and counted her cords. She stacked an armload of split cottonwood and carried it back through the passage to the cabin. Set it by the stove. Did it again. She fed the stove. She boiled water. She ate. Outside, she could hear the settlement waking up, the thud of shovels against drifted doors, men cursing in Norwegian and German and English, Magnus Thornwood's voice carrying commands about the rope lines. Normal sounds, hard sounds, but manageable. By noon, every cabin had its door dug clear. Magnus walked past Astrid's claim that afternoon without stopping. He saw the roof hatch. He saw the line of the buried tunnel framework, a low ridge in the snow leading from the cabin to the woodshed. He kept walking. He said nothing. Astrid watched him go and understood the message. One storm. Doors cleared by midday. There was nothing to remark on, nothing to reconsider. The settlement had prepared as it always had, and the settlement had survived exactly as Magnus had predicted. She went back inside and twisted more hay. November arrived slowly, and then all at once. A week of warmth, true warmth, near 50 degrees with mud in the yard and water running in the wheel ruts. Some of the settlers talked about an early thaw, a mild winter after all. Magnus's preparations vindicated, the orphan girl's tunnel nonsense forgotten. Blackwell extended credit through the end of the month. The Reinhold children played outside without coats. Astrid did not trust it. She spent the warm week cutting, Her hands were cracked at the knuckles and bled a little every morning until they warmed up. She added half a cord to the woodshed, stacked tight. She twisted more hay. She checked the tunnel frames for soft joints and retightened two that had shifted in the freeze-thaw cycle of October's aftermath. Torben helped her without being asked. He had stopped talking about whether she was right or wrong. He just worked beside her in silence, his thin face set with determination. Odin followed them everywhere, his mismatched ears alert, his border collie instincts keeping him watchful over his small family. On November 12th, the second blizzard came. No thunder this time. Just a drop in the barometer, the air going thin and gray in the space of an hour, and then white. 3 days of white. When it cleared, the snow was 4 feet on the level, and the drifts had buried Thomas Reinholdt's fence posts entirely. Only the wire showed, a thin dark line across the white. The settlers dug out. They were slower this time, more tired. Magnus spent 2 days digging a trench from his cabin door to his woodshed. He and his son Garrett worked in relay, one man digging while the other hauled. On the evening of November 14, Astrid saw Magnus walking the trench, testing the depth. It was 3 feet wide, 4 feet deep, open to the sky. One storm would fill it. Astrid watched from her roof hatch and said nothing. On November 21st, the third blizzard came. This one lasted 5 days. When the sky finally cleared on November 26th, a full week before December, the snow outside Astrid's cabin door was 6 feet deep. She did not bother trying the door. She climbed her ladder, lifted the hatch, and pulled herself onto the surface. The settlement looked different now. Not buried, not yet, but transformed. The low sod cabins had shrunk. Their roof lines sat only 2 or 3 feet above the surrounding snow. The outbuildings had nearly vanished. The Anderson family's chicken coop, a small frame structure 20 yards from their cabin, was entirely gone beneath the white. Nothing visible but a shallow rectangular rise. Magnus's open trench had filled in 24 hours. He did not have the strength to dig it again. Astrid began watching the chimneys. Every morning, she climbed through the roof hatch and stood on the snow surface and counted smoke. 11 chimneys, all of them visible above the white, all of them sending thin streams of gray into the frozen sky. But the smoke was not equal. The Thornwood chimney burned thick and steady. Magnus had resources. He had cut more wood than anyone. He would last longer than most. The Reinholdt chimney burned evenly. Thomas was efficient. He would manage. The Blackwell chimney, which had been heavy in early November, the man burning trade goods she suspected, had thinned to almost nothing by mid-December. The Bernson chimney put out almost no smoke in the mornings. The widow was rationing hard, keeping the fire at minimum to stretch her wood supply. Astrid thought about this. She thought about it for 3 weeks. A community had left her to survive alone. The community had left her to survive alone. Every cord in her wood shed, every frame in her tunnel, every hay twist by the east wall, she had built that herself in 40 days with raw hands, and no help except anonymous bundles that no one would admit to leaving. She thought about the 9 children scattered across those 11 cabins. She thought about the Bernson widow's 3 small ones, Lars and Greta and little Elsa. She thought about what it would mean if those chimneys went cold. Torben found her staring at the smoke one December morning. "What are you thinking?" he asked. Astrid did not answer for a long time. "They left us alone," she finally said. So they called me a liar. They laughed at us." Torben nodded. He remembered. He had been standing beside her in that meeting room when Magnus condemned them. He had heard Garrett Thornwood take bets on their failure. "I know," he said quietly. "Why should I help them?" Torben was silent for a moment. Then he said something that Astrid would carry with her for the rest of her life. "Because I do not want to hear children crying in my dreams forever." She looked at him, her brother who was not her brother, the boy she had saved on a steamboat 3 years ago, when she had no money and no authority, and no reason to believe she could help anyone. Someone had given her a chance when she needed one. Someone had chosen to help when they did not have to. She thought about her grandfather in Norway. She thought about his voice in the cold winters when the fishing boats could not go out and the families huddled together to survive. "Surviving alone is not surviving," he used to say. It is just waiting to die. Astrid looked at the thin smoke rising from the Bernsen chimney. She had made her decision before Torben even spoke. She had made it the moment she started counting chimneys. She just needed someone to remind her who she wanted to be. Astrid had every reason to let them suffer. They had mocked her. They had abandoned her. They had bet money on her failure. But there were children in those cabins. Children who had done nothing wrong except be born to parents who refused to listen. What would you do? She was still working out exactly how to help when February arrived and took the choice away from her entirely. The great blizzard of February 2nd came out of the northwest with thunder inside it. Astrid had seen thunder snow before, in October, in November. She had never seen anything like this. The lightning was continuous, flash after flash, lighting the wall of cloud that swallowed the horizon in the space of 10 minutes. The temperature, which had been -12 at mid-morning, dropped to -28 before noon. The wind hit 60 miles per hour and held there. She had one warning: 20 minutes of sudden stillness in which the air went absolutely cold and clear and electric. The kind of stillness that comes before something enormous. She used it. She went through the hatch and walked the surface to every chimney she could reach in 20 minutes, shouting down each one, "Storm coming! Bank your stove!" I have time for the others before the wall, have time for the others before the wall of white hit, and drove her back underground. She dropped through her hatch and pulled it shut and sat at the base of the ladder, with Torben beside her, and Odin pressed against their legs, and she listened. What she heard was not wind, it was pressure. The whole cabin breathed in and out as the gusts hit the walls. The stovepipe rang. The sod overhead flexed and dripped grit onto the floor as the temperature differential between inside and out reached 30, 40, 50 degrees. She banked the stove. She piled the hay twist close. She put on every piece of clothing she owned. Torben did the same. On 2 pairs of wool socks, 2 shirts, their heaviest coats. Odin curled up between them on the bed, his body heat adding to theirs. And they waited. For 9 days the blizzard did not stop. Astrid knew this only later, from comparing notes with the others. Inside the cabin, there was no day and no night. Just the lantern in the darkness, the stove in the cold, sleep and waking with no light to measure time by. She burned through 2 cords in those 9 days, keeping the fire constant, the cabin above freezing. She ate what she had. She slept in her coat. She did not go above the hatch. On what she thought was the 4th day, a sound came through the south wall. Faint at first, then louder, rhythmic, knocking. She pressed her ear to the sod. Someone was on the other side of her wall, beating on it with something. She could not hear a voice through the wind, but she could feel the impact. Dull, steady, a fist or a boot. She climbed the ladder and opened the hatch 6 inches. The cold hit her like a wall of knives. The wind was a physical thing, pressing against her, trying to rip the hatch from her hands. She could not see 3 feet in any direction. She screamed into the white. "Who is there?" Nothing came back, just wind. She dropped the hatch and stood at the bottom of the ladder for a long moment. Then she went to the tunnel door, pushed it open, and walked through to the woodshed. She came out through the woodshed's east-facing door into the teeth of the blizzard, sheltered slightly by the building's south wall, and found Ingrid Thornwood, Magnus's wife. Pressed flat against the cabin exterior, one arm hooked around the stovepipe collar above her head as an anchor. She had a rope tied at her waist. The rope disappeared into the white. She had walked the rope line from the Thornwood cabin in -30-degree wind, in 0 visibility, until she hit something solid. She had been knocking for 10 minutes. Her hands were gray at the fingertips. Astrid got her inside. She sat her by the stove and took her hands and rubbed them hard until the gray went pink, and Ingrid gasped with the pain of returning circulation. She gave her water. She gave her cornmeal. Ingrid said nothing for a long time. Her whole body was shaking, and not just from the cold. Then she spoke. "Magnus is burning the table." 4 words. They contained everything. The man who had dismissed Astrid in front of the entire settlement, the man who had called her a fool, The man who had said that 7 winters of experience made him certain that doors could always be dug clear by morning, that man was now burning his furniture to survive, and his wife had walked through a killing blizzard to ask for help from the girl he had condemned. Astrid gave her 4 pieces of split cottonwood and a bundle of hay twists. She loaded a crude sled, 2 boards and 2 runners, with 10 more pieces of cottonwood and tied a rope to the front. She made Ingrid hold the rope and the sled and go back the way she had come, hand over hand on the guide rope. She watched until the white swallowed her. She had 7 days of fuel left. She had just given away 2. She went home through the tunnel, through the cabin, up the ladder, and out the hatch. The world above was a flat white void, with no depth, no shadow. The sun somewhere above gave the air a faint gray light, just enough to see that the landscape had changed entirely. Where the settlement had stood, the cabins, the fences, the woodsheds, the barns, there was nothing. The snow ran level to the horizon, broken only by thin, dark lines of chimney pipes protruding from the surface like fence posts in a flooded field. Some were smoking, some were not. The ones that were not smoking scared her. She marked the smoking ones in her mind. The nearest was 30 yards northeast, the Anderson family's pipe, a thin thread of gray. She walked toward it. The snow was crusted enough to hold her weight if she moved carefully. She had snowshoes, crude things, willow frames laced with strips of oxide, and she had put them on before climbing through the hatch. They were the difference between standing and sinking. She reached the Anderson chimney and scraped snow away from the base until she found the pipe collar, the iron fitting where the stovepipe exited the roof. She disconnected the upper section with her heavy gloves and shouted down into the dark, "Astrid Halverson, I have wood." A long silence. Then Marja Anderson's voice, close and hoarse. "Thank God." She lowered 4 pieces of cottonwood down the stovepipe hole on a rope. They were not split fine enough to go easily, and she had to work them one at a time. Her bare fingers on the rope at -28 were a problem she did not think about until afterward. She reconnected the pipe and moved on. The Bernson widow's chimney was cold. No smoke. No warmth rising from the pipe. Astrid dug down through the surface snow until she found the hatch. The one she had taught Sigrid to cut in October. The one Sigrid had cut reluctantly 3 weeks after the meeting, after watching the 2nd November blizzard fill Magnus's open trench in 48 hours. She pulled the hatch open from outside. Inside, the cabin was dark and cold. Not frozen, not yet. Perhaps 30 degrees. The stove held dead ash. She dropped inside and found them in the bed. Sigrid Bernson and her 3 children, all 4 of them under every blanket and quilt in the house. The children pushed tight to the center for warmth. The smallest, Elsa, was unconscious, not dead. Astrid could feel her breath, faint against her palm, but cold enough that waking her took 2 minutes of rubbing and calling her name. Astrid pulled off her own coat and wrapped it around the child. Then she built the fire herself. She split kindling from the pieces she had brought. She fed the stove slowly, the way Niels had taught her. Too much too fast and you crack the firebox. Too little and it never catches. Torben had followed her through the hatch. He knelt beside her and helped feed the fire, his hands steady, his face determined. She watched the temperature rise, 30 to 40, 40 to 50. The widow Sigrid watched them with an expression that needed no words. Little Else opened her eyes. "I am cold," she whispered. Astrid held her close and did not let go until the child stopped shaking. It took 4 days to reach every cabin. Astrid worked in 3-hour shifts, out through the hatch at first light, snowshoes on, sled loaded, and moving from chimney to chimney in a grid pattern she had planned the night before. 3 hours outside was her limit in that cold. Her hands lost feeling at the 2-hour mark, and lost feeling meant no dexterity, and no dexterity in the middle of a blizzard 300 yards from shelter meant death. 3 hours out, then back through the hatch. Hands on the stovepipe until sensation returned. Eat something. Sleep 1 hour. Go again. Torben stayed at the cabin, keeping the fire fed, watching Odin, making sure someone would be there if Astrid did not come back. She did not tell him that was why she made him stay. She did not tell him she was terrified every time she climbed through that hatch. The Reinhold family she reached on the second day. Thomas opened his hatch from inside before Astrid even knocked. Well, he had been watching for someone, some sign of life. His face when he saw Astrid standing there in the white silence, carrying a sled of firewood, was not an expression she would ever forget. He took the wood without speaking. Then he passed down half a pound of salt pork through the hatch. Astrid took it because they both understood that charity required a transaction. He had left her supplies in September when no one else would. She had brought him fuel in February when no one else could. They were even now. That was the story they would both tell. The Thornwood cabin she saved for last. She reached it on the fourth day. The chimney had started smoking again. Ingrid's delivery had kept them alive. But the smoke was thin. She scraped snow from where the roof hatch should have been. There was no hatch. Magnus had refused to cut one. She dug down to the door instead. 4 feet of packed snow, working with the flat spade for 40 minutes in negative 25-degree air. She got the door open 1 foot. She pushed 6 pieces of cottonwood through the gap. She heard Magnus's voice on the other side. Low, hoarse, humbled. Astrid! Yes. A long pause. The wind howled above them both. Come inside. Astrid looked at the dark gap in the door, at the man who had condemned her in front of the entire settlement, who had called her a fool, who had told her that when she failed, the children of the valley would freeze with her. I have finished my deliveries, she said. I need to get back. It was true, she had finished. There was no one else. But she was also not ready to hear what Magnus would say. She was not ready for his apology or his gratitude or whatever he had prepared during those 9 days of burning furniture and waiting to be saved by the girl he had dismissed. She pushed the door shut and began filling the trench with snow. She did not look back. The storm broke on approximately February 11th. Astrid knew it by the silence. The wind stopped between one breath and the next, and the absence of it was so complete that she woke from sleep certain something was wrong. She climbed the ladder and opened the hatch and looked out into a still, cold, brilliant morning. The sky was clear. The temperature was negative 25. The sun hit the snow surface and threw back a light that was nearly impossible to look at. 11 chimney pipes stood in the white like markers in a cemetery. Every single one was smoking. He scrambled through the hatch after him, his face in his hands. Torben climbed up beside her. Odin scrambled through the hatch after him, his paws struggling for purchase on the frozen surface. The 3 of them sat there in the silence, watching the smoke rise from 11 chimneys. And for a long time, nobody said anything. Astrid did not cry. She had not cried since the day they buried Niels. But she was close. 45 people in 11 cabins. 9 days of the worst blizzard in Dakota Territory history. Temperatures that could kill in 3 minutes. Wind that could blind you at arm's length. And not one person died. Because a 19-year-old girl had built a tunnel that everyone laughed at. Because she had chosen to save the people who had abandoned her. The Magnus Thornwood called the meeting on February 14th when the surface trenches were solid enough to move between cabins without snowshoes. They met in the Reinhold cabin, the only structure with ceiling height enough to stand in. 11 families crowded around the table and along the walls, bundled in coats, faces drawn from 4 months of cold and rationing and fear. Astrid sat in the corner with Torben beside her and Odin lying at their feet. She had been the youngest person in that September meeting when they had laughed at her. She was still the youngest now, but everything else had changed. Magnus stood at the front. He was a big man. He had always been a big man, but the winter had taken something off him. His coat hung differently. His face was cut by new lines that had not been there in September. I have lived on this prairie for 7 years. I have seen storms that killed oxen standing. I have never been wrong about a winter. He paused. I was wrong about this one. The room was absolutely silent. The girl was right. I owe her my family's lives, and I am not a man who forgets a debt. He sat down heavily, as if the words had cost him something he could not replace. Thomas Reinhold spoke next. He had been working something out since October, Astrid could tell. The way a careful man works out a calculation he keeps getting wrong. He had the look of someone who had finally found the error in his own arithmetic. I said a girl could not cut 15 cords alone. Reinhold said slowly. I was right. Or she cut 8. He paused. I said the tunnel was impossible for one person. I was wrong. She built the frame in 12 days and let the snow do the digging. He looked at Astrid for the first time since the meeting began. I was thinking about the problem with a man's assumptions. She was thinking about it with a reader's imagination. The arithmetic was mine. The engineering was hers. He sat down. Elias Blackwell said nothing for a long time. He had lost most of his trade inventory to the stove. His bid to expand his business was gone. His reputation as a man who knew things was damaged beyond easy repair. When he finally spoke, he kept his eyes on the table. I do not apologize. The room stirred. Murmurs of disapproval. Blackwell raised his hand. I said what any reasonable man would say. I'm a 19-year-old girl raising an orphan boy, talking about Eskimo tunnels based on muskrat houses and Indian prophecies. He shook his head slowly. Would you have believed her? He looked up finally and met Astrid's eyes. I was wrong about what she was capable of, but I was not wrong to doubt. It was not an apology, it was not warmth, but it was honesty. And from Blackwell, that was as much as anyone could expect. Father Brennan rose from his seat. I spoke of superstition, he said quietly. I spoke of faith in rodents rather than faith in providence. He smiled, a small, rueful expression. Perhaps I should remember that the Lord speaks through many messengers, even muskrats. Soft laughter rippled through the room, the first laughter any of them had shared in months. At the end of the meeting, Magnus made an announcement. We will dig her claim clear before we dig our own. Every man here. No one argued. By the end of February, every cabin in the settlement had a roof hatch. Garrett Thornwood, who had bet $5 on the tunnel collapsing, cut his father's hatch himself. He worked in methodical silence, the way his father did everything, and when he finished, he walked to Astrid's cabin and handed her a $5 gold piece. I lost the bet, he said simply. Astrid tried to give it back. Garrett shook his head. Keep it. I owe you more than money. Thomas Reinhold built his hatch with squared lumber and iron hinges, the only iron hinges in the settlement. It closed so cleanly that from outside you could not find the seam. The Anderson family's oldest daughter, who was 11, cut her family's hatch herself. She worked 3 evenings after supper until the framing was solid. The technique spread. Settlers from Kingsbury County came to see the hatches. Settlers from Beetle County sent word asking for instructions. Traveling homesteaders carried the idea the way they carried seeds and tool patterns. By description, by demonstration, by the simple observation that the people who had hatches had survived and the people who had not had suffered. No one called it anything in particular. It was just a thing you did now. The widow Sigrid Bernsen came to Astrid in March. She brought a smoked haunch of venison, her last good meat. You saved my children, Sigrid said. Astrid took half the haunch and left the rest. I am not ready for people to owe me, she said quietly. Not yet. Sigrid looked at her for a long moment. At this girl who had been mocked and abandoned and left to survive alone, who had saved them all anyway. You are already more ready than you know, Sigrid said. Spring came slowly to the James River Valley. The snow did not meaningfully recede until late April. On the 23rd, water began running in the wheel ruts for the first time since October. On the 30th, the river came back into view, swollen and brown and fast, running over its banks into the lowlands. Spring brought its own violence. The Missouri flooded catastrophically to the south. Towns went underwater. The full toll of the winter emerged as the territory thawed. Thousands of cattle had died on the open range. Dozens of homesteads had been abandoned. Families who had spent everything on a claim lost it to the cold and limped back east with nothing. The winter of 1880 to 1881 would end the first wave of Dakota settlement. It would take years for the land to fill again. But in the James River Valley, the settlers rebuilt. They built better than before. They built with hatches in their roofs and the knowledge that the old ways, the ways passed down through generations, had value that no amount of experience could replace. Pause for reflection. The settlement along the James River lost no one that winter, not a single death, not a single amputation. 3 cases of frostbite, 2 minor, 1 serious. Across 4 counties, 67 people died in the blizzards of 1880 to 1881. The James River Valley survived because a 19-year-old girl had watched muskrats and listened to elders and read a book about the Arctic, and because she had chosen to save the people who had abandoned her. For years past, Astrid proved her foster father's claim and filed it in her own name in the spring of 1888, the year she turned 27. Torben stood beside her at the courthouse. He was 21 now, tall, strong. The thin, frightened boy she had rescued from a steamboat had become a man she was proud to call her brother. They had divided the quarter section between them, half for her, half for him. "Why are you keeping the old woodshed?" Torben asked as they walked home from the courthouse. "You built a new one 3 years ago." Astrid looked at the weathered structure standing in the yard, the same woodshed she had connected to the cabin with a tunnel in 1880, the same doorway she had walked through 1,000 times. "Because that is where we survived," she said simply. "That is where we proved them wrong." She did not say more. She did not need to. Torben understood. Astrid married Thomas Reinhold's son, Thomas Jr., in 1885. It was a quiet wedding, practical, like everything else in her life. Thomas Jr. was a good man, steady, kind. He understood that his wife had saved his family's life when he was a boy of 15, and he never forgot it. Torben married Elsa Bernsen in 1892. The 4-year-old girl who had been unconscious in her mother's bed during the Great Blizzard was 19 when she walked down the aisle toward the man who had helped save her life. She remembered nothing of that terrible night, but she had grown up hearing the story, and she had grown up knowing that Torben and Astrid were the reason she was alive. Odin died in 1889. He was 14 years old, ancient for a dog, and he went peacefully in his sleep on a warm September evening, with his head resting on Astrid's lap. They buried him beside the old woodshed, the woodshed he had guarded through 9 winters, the woodshed where he had waited with Torben while Astrid climbed through the hatch into the killing cold. Torben carved the marker himself. Odin, faithful friend, 1875 to 1889. Astrid stood at the grave for a long time after the burial, looking at the weathered boards of the shed, remembering the night she had found Ingrid Thornwood pounding on the wall with frostbitten hands, remembering the tunnel, remembering the hatch, remembering everything they had built together. The sod cabin was replaced by a frame house before Astrid turned 30. The old oxen were replaced by horses. The kerosene lamps were eventually replaced by electricity. But Astrid kept the woodshed. She kept it long after there was any practical need for it. Long after coal and kerosene and eventually gas had replaced cottonwood in the stove. Neighbors thought it was sentiment. Maybe it was. In 1931, Astrid Halvorsen Reinhold was 70 years old. She sat on the porch of the farmhouse she had lived in for more than 40 years, looking out at the land that had almost killed her and her brother half a century before. The drought had come, the dust had come, the world was changing again, the way it always changed, and the people who lived on the land were once again being tested. Torben came to visit that autumn. He was 64 now, gray-haired with 6 grandchildren and a farm of his own on the other half of their foster father's claim. He sat beside her on the porch, and for a while, neither of them said anything. They had never needed many words. Then Torben asked the question he had wondered about for 50 years. "Why did you keep the old woodshed, Astrid? All these years. Why?" Astrid looked at the weathered structure standing in the yard, the same woodshed she had connected to the cabin with a tunnel half a century ago. The same doorway she had walked through carrying firewood while the world above raged with deadly white. She was quiet for a long moment. Then she spoke. "Because that is where I learned the most important thing I know." "What?" She turned to look at him, her brother who was not her brother, the frightened boy she had rescued from a steamboat more than 50 years ago, the man who had stood beside her through everything. "That family is not about blood, Torben. Family is the people who pull the sled for each other in the storm." She reached over and took his weathered hand in hers. "And you," she said softly, "are the only family I ever needed." Astrid Halvorsen Reinhold died in 1934 at the age of 73. She was buried beside Niels, the foster father who had taught her to read the land. and beside Odin, the dog who had kept watch over her family for 14 years. The old woodshed stood for another 20 years before Torben's grandson finally took it down. But by then, the story had spread far beyond the James River Valley. The story of a girl who had watched muskrats and listened to elders and built a tunnel that saved 45 lives. The story of a brother and sister who were not related by blood, but who had chosen each other anyway. The story of what it means to save the people who abandon you. Not because they deserve it, but because that is who you choose to be. In the blizzard of February 1881, a 19-year-old girl and her 13-year-old brother saved 45 people who had laughed at them and left them to survive alone. They did not do it because they were asked. They did not do it because those people deserved it. They did it because that is what family does. Even when the family's not blood. Even when the people being saved do not deserve to be saved. Sometimes the most important thing you can do is pull the sled for the people who abandon you, not because they earned it, but because you have decided what kind of person you want to be. If this story moved you, I would love to hear what stayed with you the most. And if there is someone in your life who has pulled the sled for you, who has chosen to be your family even though they did not have to, maybe today is a good day to tell them what that has meant.